Today you find me on the banks of the River Clyde, and on the 3rd of July 1883, it wasn't quite as peaceful as it looks today. Hundreds of people were here, literally on the bank I'm standing on, and on the other side of the river, to celebrate the launch of a new steamship. But it didn't quite go to plan. What was supposed to be a day of celebration turned into a tragedy of huge proportions. This is the tragic launch of the SS Daphne. During the early 1880s, Glasgow was really the heart of a shipbuilding revolution, and the shipyards on the Clyde were churning out vessel after vessel after vessel. They were really moving at an unprecedented pace. And amongst the type of vessels they were building were small cargo steamers, fishing trawlers, transatlantic liners, really anything that was in high demand at the time. And one of the yards on the Clyde was Alexander Stephen & Sons, based at Linthouse. Now, Alexander Stephen & Sons, or just Stevens as they were known, had technically been in the shipbuilding business since 1750. And in the 133 years between 1750 and 1883, where we find ourselves for this story, the company had changed a lot, and changed hands a lot. And it was in 1870 that the company found themselves on a new site at Linthouse on the River Clyde in Glasgow. And in the decade that followed, they found themselves working at full capacity. They were turning out vessels at incredible speed. But unfortunately, this had consequences. Which brings us to the Daphne. Now, no photos of the Daphne seem to exist apart from the ones that were taken in the aftermath of this disaster, but here's a similar steamship. And we do have this profile schematic sketch. She was a relatively modest ship by the standards of the time, a 500-ton cargo steamer, and she was ultimately being made to serve the coastal trade, carrying goods between ports quickly and cheaply. Her launch had been scheduled for Tuesday, July the 3rd, 1883, and as was common practice at the time, she wasn't finished, with ships often still being worked on as they were launched, which, in this case, meant that at the launch there were between 150 and 200 workmen still on board, with the plan being that they were there to start working on her funnels, various different fittings, and internal machinery once she was already afloat. And looking back at it now, it's a very ominous sign of how saving money, time, and being efficient was seen as more valuable than having a focus on the health and safety of the men doing the work, because the practice of having men on board during a launch was not unusual, to the extent that having men on board who could get straight to work as soon as the ship was in the water was seen as incredibly efficient. But, as we will see, that efficiency came at an incredibly high cost. This doesn't look anything like the old photos. It's changed somewhat. Let's just say it didn't used to be BAE systems over there. But as you can see, we'll do a little compare and contrast between the photos from the 1880s and it now. It's incredibly different. In fact, I looked at Google Maps before we came here to try and get an idea of like the lay of the land, and not even that huge warehouse you can see there behind me was there on Google Maps, so even that is new. Now, as you can see from this old map, the Linthouse shipbuilding yards are actually slightly further up from where I'm standing, but it was a little bit difficult to get access to that area, so where I am is about as close as I could get. It is, even standing right here, because it's just so different now, it's very, very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of everyone who was stood here watching this launch, and the absolute just horror they must have felt seeing this happen. It's just very, very difficult to comprehend. July the 3rd, 1883. Huge crowds had gathered along the riverbanks to watch the SS Daphne's launch. As we've touched on in other videos, including the one on the launch of HMS Albion, launches in this period of time were incredibly popular, and were usually a big draw for crowds, and the Daphne was no exception. Everything was trucking along as usual, and at around midday, the restraining blocks were knocked away and she began to slide down the slip into the water. And this is where things went wrong. At first, she entered the water smoothly, but then, almost immediately, the ship began to list. One eyewitness from the scene reported, "She heeled over to port, paused, and then rapidly rolled over." Almost immediately, the Daphne capsized, and at least 120 men were trapped in the ship, around the ship, in full view of their families who had come to see the launch. All in all, according to the witnesses who were there, it took just 3 minutes from the start of the launch to Daphne being completely capsized in the River Clyde. And of course, that gave the men still on board barely any time to save themselves. And according to those who were there, the air was immediately filled with screams from those watching on the riverbanks, but also from the men still aboard. Some men clung to the hull, others were dragged under. Some men apparently immediately tried to scramble round the side of the ship as she capsized, in an effort to either continue to cling to the sides or get to the bottom of the now upturned ship. But in the process of capsizing, she was completely covered by waves, and thus anyone who'd succeeded in making it to the side or bottom of the ship was washed into the water. Men who'd been inside the boat at the time became trapped in the engine rooms and inside the bulkheads, and the River Clyde that had been calm moments earlier was now a scene of unimaginable horror, with the luckiest men who had been thrown from the ship or managed to jump thrashing in the water or clinging to debris, while those who had been forced under by the ship would never be heard from again. It really is awful to imagine. Apparently, what is also terrifying is when the ship capsized, there were reports of screams being heard from the upturned hull of the boat, from the men that were still trapped inside in small pockets of air, wherever they happened to find themselves. And the rescuers just couldn't get to all of them fast enough. And their situation would only have been made worse by the fact that the ship, still being worked on, would have had loose tools and equipment lying around everywhere. And when the boat listed and ultimately capsized, all of those tools and loose machinery and parts would have been thrown everywhere, along with the men inside. And despite the rescue effort starting straight away, obviously this was not an easy situation to deal with. There wasn't a lot they could do beyond rescue the people who happened to have fallen outside of the ship and were just floating on debris or just swimming in the river itself. Everyone trapped inside was in a much worse situation. People and workers nearby immediately rushed to help. Boats were launched from neighbouring yards down the river, and ropes were thrown into the water along with planks of wood and anything else that could be used as a makeshift life raft. Like we just mentioned, some of those men who were thrown into the water were the luckiest and managed to swim to shore or be picked up by some of those rescue boats. But again, for the men still on board, there was little chance of escape. According to the Glasgow Herald, the bulkheads in the ship were airtight, trapping men below. The hatches had not been battened down, and water quickly flooded in. Those inside were sealed in darkness as the ship rolled. After the initial chaos had died down, and those who could be rescued immediately had been saved from the water, a diver was called for, and efforts began to retrieve bodies from the interior of the ship, which was, of course, an incredibly dangerous task. And as bodies were retrieved, a makeshift mortuary was set up, where family members and friends could come and identify the dead. And the reports of the relatives at the scene are heartbreaking. At one time, a young widow with tearless eyes and grief-stricken countenance was to be seen fondly caressing the brow of her dead husband, while at another, a newly made widow gave vent to piercing shrieks as she recognized the form of him who had been her stay and comfort. Parents with bent forms and grey heads came to look for the remains of their sons, and brothers and sisters wept sorely as they identified the friends they had lost. Rescuers began dragging the river around the Daphne in an attempt to find some of the bodies. But it took hours, and for all their efforts, they only found a few. It seemed that many of the men who weren't trapped aboard the ship but had lost their lives beneath the waves had been washed further down the river with the current. It took divers days to recover the remaining bodies, not all of which were actually found. In fact, as there were many people still working on the ship, it's not completely certain how many men were still aboard, or who those people were. We now believe that around 124 men and boys who were aboard died, leaving roughly 70 men who survived. And the youngest confirmed victim I've been able to find was a 14-year-old boy called John Ladden. And the impact of this to the local community was devastating. Again, according to the Herald, in Govan alone, one street saw 3 adjacent houses lose a total of 12 men between them. And remember, for a lot of the men that died, their families were there to see it. It's just heartbreaking. After the accident, the government quickly launched a Board of Trade inquiry, which uncovered several grave mistakes. Again, as I've touched on in previous videos, launching a ship is not as straightforward as you might think, and there are many things that need to be taken into account to make sure it's done successfully. And in the investigation, it was found that no ballast had been installed. Ballast is essentially extra weight added to the ship's hull, usually placed lower in the vessel to ultimately lower its center of gravity and make it less likely to roll, to improve its stability and balance, which, unfortunately for this situation, becomes all the more useful when you have a lighter ship. Which meant as soon as the Daphne hit the water, she was immediately unstable. Her engines were already fitted or in the process of being fitted, which meant the ship's center of gravity, with no ballast installed, had been raised. And the ship contained some large, sealed compartments that trapped air. And as soon as she began to list, this trapped air prevented her from righting herself. And as she listed more and more, water surged into the still open hatches and pulled her under. It also seems as though anchors that were attached by cable to each side of the ship in order to slow its progress into the water had failed, and as soon as it hit the water, it was caught by the river's current and flipped, immediately capsizing her in the deep water. And it was the combination of these things, plus probably also the number of men who were aboard, that ultimately caused this to happen, and caused it to happen as fast as it did. The conclusion of the inquiry was the cause of the accident was a lack of stability due to poor launch preparation. It was concluded that the design specifications for the ship were based purely on the fact that no similar ship had capsized before. On the 28th of July, once it had been raised, stability tests were carried out, which revealed the shortcomings of the design. But who was to blame? The board ultimately decided not to hold the Stevens Yard criminally responsible, instead using this tragedy as something of a lesson for future ship launches, attributing the disaster to outdated practices and a general commonplace underestimation of risk. Which brings us back to the general commonplace practice of the time, a focus on efficiency and speed over safety. And again, the human cost of this was clearly immediate to everyone there and devastating. Okay, I'm now at Craigton Cemetery, which is about a 7-minute drive from where we were on the River Clyde, so not too far, which is where the first memorial of 3, there were 2 later memorials, but where the first memorial to the victims of the sinking of the SS Daphne was placed. Well, we found it. It is pretty obvious, but there are more memorials that look incredibly similar to it than I was expecting to find here. Behind me, just here, is the first memorial to the victims of the SS Daphne. According to the research that I've done, there are about 50 victims here. It's quite hard to make out the inscription on this, but there are names here. Definitely not 50 names, but there's a few names of some of the men who were aboard. I can see John, Manson, Malcolm, Morrison, Henry Clark, but definitely not 50, so it'd be interesting to find out why all 50 aren't marked on the memorial. Just behind me over here is a similar height memorial, and over here, there you go, there's a couple more that are almost identical, but just for individuals, whereas this one here is for over 50 men. So just had to retreat under a tree because obviously perfect timing, we get here and the heavens open. But you can see the memorial behind me over there. I think what's quite interesting is this is clearly a very old section of the cemetery, and these huge tall memorials are the only things, literally the only things that are still standing in this section. As you can see behind me over here, and I'll get a few more shots of them, but every other gravestone here has toppled over. Everything is lying down. Almost looks like somebody's come round and just knocked them over. And obviously these have been here for a very long time, so have the memorials, the huge memorials, but it's interesting that every single one of these headstones is on the floor. I don't know why, maybe they weren't built quite as well as these, but I don't know, there's something interesting to the fact that our memorial to the SS Daphne is one of the only ones that's still standing in this section, despite how long it's been. Going back to those 3 houses that lost 12 men, dozens of other families had lost their sole wage earners. And on top of that, many of the victims were just boys, either apprentices or junior fitters who were on board learning their trade. The only silver lining of this is that the disaster was used to introduce changes to make the industry safer. Shipyards began to make sure that launched vessels had at least a partial ballast installed. It became generally discouraged to have a large crew aboard during the launch, and watertight bulkheads were redesigned to allow for pressure equalization and also for safe escape routes. The Daphne tragedy unfortunately did not immediately revolutionize safety in shipbuilding, but it did contribute to a growing awareness that ultimately speed was not a good enough excuse to forget safety. Ultimately, the SS Daphne was meant to be a workhorse, a simple cargo ship with a pretty unremarkable future. What she became instead was one amongst a series of symbolic tragedies that led to important changes in safety when it came to shipbuilding and ship launching. It became another example, along with many others that I've covered on this channel, of when the risk to the lives of workers is considered acceptable just to get things done a little bit faster. Now, as for what happened to the SS Daphne, she was actually raised and repaired and renamed, and in what seems like an incredibly misplaced pun, they renamed her the SS Rose. Not 100% sure how I would have felt about that if I had lost a family member who was not brought back from the depths of the Clyde. But hey, maybe shipbuilders have a slightly more morbid sense of humour. And she went on to have something of an inauspicious career. Early on in 1884, grounding at Farlane Point in Millport, fortunately not sustaining any damage and being refloated. She was sold later in 1884 and renamed Lanth, and then sent to the Eastern Mediterranean. She was then sold again in 1890 and renamed Eleni, and then finally, on the 10th of December 1918, she was lost when she was mined off of Tenedos in Greece. Thanks for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed this one. It was an awesome, kind of, horribly sad thing to find out about on this trip to Scotland. But still, as ever, important to remember these horrible events that may have happened, over 100 years ago, but men with families and children lost their lives in this, and I think it doesn't matter how old it is or how long ago it happened, it's still important to remember these stories for as long as we can. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.